Okay, so here's a question nobody really asks out loud. When someone died in ancient times, like way before civilization, before funerals, before religion, before any of that, what did they actually do with the body? Like, picture it. You're living in a small group of maybe 20 people, no buildings, no laws, no priests. Someone just dies. What happens next? And before you say they buried them, yeah, sometimes. But the real answer is way weirder, way darker, and honestly, kind of beautiful in the most unexpected ways. Because what archaeologists have found is not what anyone expected. And some of it will genuinely make you rethink what it even means to be human. Let's get into it. Burial might not even be a human invention. Here's the thing that breaks people's brains when they first hear it. We always assumed burial was our thing. Like humans figured out death, humans felt the emotion of loss, humans decided to put bodies in the ground. It was one of the things that separated us from animals. Except, turns out we might not have invented it. In South Africa, deep inside a cave system called Rising Star, researchers found evidence that a species called Homo naledi was deliberately burying their dead. And here's the wild part. Homo naledi had a brain only about 1/3 the size of ours. We're talking roughly the brain size of a chimpanzee. They were small. They weren't smart by any measure we normally use. And yet they were apparently hauling bodies into deep, dark, dangerous cave passages on purpose to put them to rest. The lead scientist on the project said something that stuck with me. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that humans may not have even invented this behavior, that something much older than us might have been doing it first. So the next time someone says burying the dead is what makes us human, the science says maybe not. The most lavish burials weren't for the most important adults. They were for children. Okay, so in Russia, about 34,000 years ago, there's this burial site called Sunghyr, and it's one of the most mind-blowing archaeological finds in history. Researchers found several people buried there, including an adult man who would have been a hunter, a contributor to the group, someone you'd assume would get the big send-off. And he did get a pretty impressive burial, around 3,000 mammoth ivory beads sewn into his clothing. But then they found the children's burial, a boy and a girl placed head to head, and their grave even more lavish, more beads, more treasures, carefully crafted mammoth ivory spears, which would have taken enormous time and skill to make, placed with kids who never hunted a day in their lives. Nobody knows why. The most decorated burials at this site went to children who couldn't have earned it in any conventional sense. Some researchers think they were sacrificed, others think they were seen as spiritually important. But the honest answer is, we have no idea. What we do know is that 34,000 years ago, some humans were giving their most elaborate funerals to kids. And that raises a lot of questions about what value meant to them. The man in that famous burial was probably murdered. Here's the detail that changes everything about Sunghyr. That adult male, the one covered in thousands of beads and ivory, died from a cut to the neck. Specifically, an incision into the base of his neck that would have immediately cut off blood flow to his brain. So the most elaborately honored prehistoric burial ever found in that part of the world. The guy was almost certainly killed, then given a king's funeral. Was it a ritual sacrifice? Was he killed in a fight and then honored for it? Was this a form of mercy killing that the group then mourned deeply? We genuinely don't know. But someone 34,000 years ago looked at this man, killed him, or found him after he was killed, and then spent what must have been weeks of effort sewing thousands of tiny ivory beads onto his burial clothes. That is not the behavior of people who didn't care. They didn't always stay away after the burial. You'd think once you buried someone, that was it. Graves closed. Goodbye. Nope. There's growing evidence that prehistoric groups would return to burial sites months, sometimes much longer, after a person died. And they wouldn't just visit, they'd dig up the remains. Researchers found bones that had been manipulated well after death. The tissue was already partially decomposed, but the bones still had some flexibility. That means they came back at least several months later, deliberately reopened the grave, and handled the remains. And the detail that really hits, researchers pointed out This could mean the living people actually knew the deceased. They weren't random strangers raiding old graves. They were probably returning to someone they had personally known. Why? We don't fully know. Maybe to move the bones to a different place. Maybe to take a piece of them. Maybe to perform some ritual they felt was unfinished. But the idea that death was a one-time event, body goes in, never touched again. That's a modern assumption. Ancient humans kept a relationship with their dead long after burial. Some of them turned their dead into drinking cups. All right. This one, 14,700 years ago in a cave in Somerset, England called Gough's Cave, a group of prehistoric humans did something that sounds like a horror movie, but was almost certainly a sacred ritual. When someone died, they didn't bury them. They carefully removed all the flesh, including cutting the lips, cheeks, tongue, and eyes. Then they removed the base of the skull and the facial bones. And then they shaped the top of the skull, the dome, into a bowl, a cup. 3 of these skull cups have been found at this site. And here's what makes researchers confident this wasn't just dark practicality. There was plenty of animal meat available. They weren't starving. And one of the forearm bones found in the cave was engraved with a zigzag pattern after the flesh was already removed, meaning the marking was part of the ritual, not an accident. This was deliberate, this was ceremonial, and it wasn't unique to this cave. Similar practices have been found across Magdalenian culture sites in Europe. They weren't monsters. They were doing something that, to them, was probably deeply meaningful. We just no longer have the context to understand what. They were eating the dead, but not because they were hungry. Connected to that, the cannibalism at Gough's Cave was almost certainly not about survival. Bones show evidence of being cracked for marrow, chewed, defleshed, the full picture. But here's the thing that flips the narrative. This was not a group that was starving. Animal bones at the same site show they had access to plenty of meat. So why eat the dead? The most likely answer, based on how similar practices work in the ethnographic record, meaning cultures that still practiced it in recent history, is that consuming a person was a way of keeping them with you, of absorbing their strength, their spirit, their identity. It wasn't violence, it was, in its own way, a form of love. Or at least reverence. That's one of those things that's genuinely hard to wrap your head around. But it reframes the whole thing. Ancient humans carried their relatives' skulls around with them. Here's a behavior that shows up over and over across prehistoric cultures in Europe and the Middle East. When someone died, their skull was kept. Not buried, kept, carried, possibly displayed. The thinking behind this was that the spirit of the person resided in the head, so by keeping the skull, you were keeping them with you. It was a way of maintaining a connection across death, of making sure the ancestor was still present in the life of the group. And in some cases, skulls were being carefully stored and passed down. Researchers describe it as a kind of ancestor cult. The idea that the dead weren't gone, they were just in a different form, and they still mattered, still had influence, still needed to be included. This is the part where you start to see that ancient humans weren't just reacting to death out of confusion or fear. They had thought about it. They had developed frameworks for it. They just looked very different from ours. The oldest known burial is a 3-year-old, placed like they were sleeping. This one is quiet, but it hits hard. 78,000 years ago, in a cave in Kenya called Panga ya Saidi, a 3-year-old child died. And whoever was there with them, their family, their group, didn't just leave the body. They dug a pit. They placed the child inside, curled into a fetal position, and they covered them quickly, deliberately, carefully. 78,000 years ago, someone lost a toddler, and they placed that child to rest like they were just going to sleep. We don't know what they believed about what happened after death. We don't know if they cried. We don't know if they said anything over the grave. But we know they didn't just walk away. And that tells you something. The most elaborate funerals happened, then disappeared. Here's something that completely breaks the humans got smarter over time narrative. We tend to think of history as progress. Things get more complex, more sophisticated, more developed. But the burial record doesn't follow that pattern at all. Around 30,000 years ago, you see some of the most extraordinary burials in human prehistory. Sites like Sunghir, thousands of ivory beads, incredibly complex rituals, massive effort put into honoring the dead. Then, over the next several thousand years, those elaborate burials basically disappear. The most ornate ones are anomalies, not the beginning of a trend. One archaeologist studying this said something that stuck with me. Burial behavior waxes and wanes depending on the conditions people live under. Meaning, when times got harder, when survival became the priority, the elaborate rituals went away. People simplified. The complexity came back later, in different forms, in different places. Death rituals aren't a straight line of progress. They respond to circumstances, and 30,000 years ago, some group of humans put more effort into burying their dead than most societies did for thousands of years afterward. Two different species started burying the dead at the same time after meeting each other. This might be the strangest detail of all. In the Levant, the region covering modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, something unusual happened during the Middle Paleolithic. Both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals suddenly began burying their dead, around the same period, in the same region. Neither species had a significant tradition of doing this before, and then right when the two species were overlapping, coming into contact with each other, both started doing it. The leading theory? Population density increased as the two species shared the same territory. And with that, burial practices appeared possibly spreading between groups, possibly emerging from the same social pressures of living near each other. Which means burial, one of the things we consider most deeply human, might have spread like a cultural trend. Maybe humans saw Neanderthals doing it and adopted it. Maybe it went the other way. Maybe both groups arrived at it independently at the exact same moment. Either way, the behavior that we think of as uniquely human might have been a shared invention between two different species. So when you ask what ancient humans did when someone died, the answer isn't simple. They kept skulls. They came back to dig up the bones. They made cups out of them. They ate the dead as a form of honor. They buried children as kings. They returned to graves months later. They carried their relatives with them, and somewhere in all of that, in all the strange, dark, unexpected ways they dealt with death, you can feel something recognizable, something that looks a lot like grief and love, and the desperate human need to keep the people we lose close. That part hasn't changed at all. If you found this interesting, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.